What to talk about today? In Rosh Hashanah, I spoke to you about voting. Miriam preached about voting last week. Jonah mentioned the election. You know you need to vote. If you don't, I'm not going to convince you today. Many of you have already voted. Now we have to make sure that all the votes are counted. See our weekly email for ways that our Beth Am members are organizing to ensure the integrity of this election. So I don't want to talk to you about voting again today. Over the past several years, I've spoken to you about justice and kindness, empathy, about immigration and kids in cages and gun violence, and systemic racism beyond, within, and radiating out from places and persons within the Jewish community. 2 weeks ago, I spoke about reproductive rights, and we've spoken about the pandemic, and the pandemic, and the pandemic. This past week marked the 2-year anniversary of the Tree of Life Synagogue massacre. I don't really want to talk to you about that today either. Not really, but I do want to elevate for a moment a heartbreaking essay that I read in the foreword based on a longer essay in a new book by Pittsburgh writers reflecting on that tragedy in 2018. This essay is from Eric Lidgy, the archivist of the Tree of Life shooting. I've collected 189 boxes of things documenting the impact of those 83 minutes on the Jewish population of Western Pennsylvania, he writes. Things in this case means things you can touch: flyers, programs, signs, speeches, sermons, posters, and the many letters and gifts sent as gestures of consolation. They currently occupy a section of metal shelves in the back corner of the archive where I work. Down one long row and halfway down the next, seeing all these things together in one place is overwhelming. They are the manifestation of a collective emotional response to one tragedy. In the archives of other communities are the responses to other tragedies. If you multiply our shells by those tragedies and imagine standing before all of it, you can appreciate the enduring relevance of the Talmudic dictum by Abba Binyamin. If the eye were given permission to see them, no creature would be able to withstand the demons surrounding us. Grief is a class of demon. If we could see it, its ubiquity would be unbearable. Lidgy describes the emotional breakdown he experienced on his way to the synagogue the morning after the attack. As I sat there in the car that morning wondering what had just happened, I had an epiphany almost too big to handle. It was this: someone is always feeling what I just felt. Grief is always striking somewhere, and just as the reverberations diminish in one place, grief strikes anew somewhere else. Grief is one of the constant undertones of human existence. So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Grief, but not grief. Coping, but not coping. Joy, which is to say, how do we function when grief is so ubiquitous, when anxiety is so prevalent, when uncertainty feels like the only certainty? If you're watching Lovecraft Country on HBO, you know that part of the answer is joy. And one thing I've learned over the years living where I do is that while Black people don't want to be acknowledged for their grief, their trauma, they don't define themselves by those things. And they don't want others defining them that way either. The Jewish people, too, have endured more pain, more loss than can be fathomed. These are the demons that surround us. And we live with them, well, in part by laughing. Like this: 2 panhandlers are sitting outside the Vatican. One displays a large cross and the other a Jewish star. The beggar with the cross has a cup overflowing with money, while the Jewish beggar has only a few coins. The priest or a priest walks by and notices the disparity. He approaches the Jewish beggar. "Excuse me, but you do realize that this is the center of the Catholic world. You'll never raise money with that Star of David on your cup." The beggar with the star turns to the one with the cross and says, "Hey, Moshe, look who wants to teach us marketing." We laugh at our oppressors, and we laugh at ourselves, and we celebrate our cleverness as we game systems sometimes rigged against us. Our survival over the centuries has depended on it. Where we've really thrived as a people, though, is when we access our joy. Shir hamalot b'shuv Adonai et shivat Zion hayinu kechomim. When the Lord restores the fortunes of Zion, we see it as in a dream. Az yimales chok pinu ulshonenu rina. Our mouths shall be filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. These are the words from Psalm 126. We sing at the head of each Shabbos and Yontif benching. We don't ignore our suffering, but we insist it is not our reason for existing. Hazorim bedim'ah, berina yitzoru. Those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Jewish joy is made manifest in numerous ways, in sumptuous holiday food, in meaningful time with family and community, in the pride we may feel watching a child achieve the age of mitzvot. This last type of joy is the most uniquely Jewish, what the Hasidic tradition calls simcha shel mitzvah, the joy of robust engagement with our traditions, our practices, and yes, our sacred texts. Rabbi Kalanimus Kalman Shapira, the Piazetzna Rebbe, explores the character of Abraham from this week's Parsha in his book Derech HaMelech, which he wrote just before the Shoah. The Piazetzner is interested in what animates Abraham and what motivates God to choose him to be the first Jew. He explains that it has to do with Abraham's misirat nefesh, complete dedication. It is only fitting to serve the Holy One of Blessing. This service shouldn't be merely declarative, expressed in words and gestures. It should not be merely performative, consisting of perfunctory ritual. Rather, it should be done with all of our body and soul, with our strength and our might. This is how Abraham survives the fiery furnace into which Nimrod, the wicked, casts him, because his entire being was infused with Torah learning and doing. The legend to which Rabbi Shapiro refers is a famous midrash about the trials of Abraham, in which the oral tradition offers us a figure who has endured great trauma. The Piazetzner also knew trauma, and he writes about it. Today, we Jews are also prepared to live our lives over for the Holy, or to give our lives over for the Holy One of Blessing. We all still remember, he says, how in this very generation, thousands of Jews gave their lives in Ukraine during the pogroms al Kiddush Hashem, as did preceding generations. All of these holy people were gathered to be killed only because they were Jews. And then the Piazetzner makes an interesting move. He refers to the concept of mesirat nefesh, total dedication to God, which is usually the term reserved to describe Jewish martyrdom, Jewish practices worth dying for. Because of our reverence for life, these are few and far between. Most observances are not worth dying for. If someone tells you to, say, eat a crab cake under penalty of death, guess what? You eat the crab cake. Now, I know this is the only reason that you might do such a thing. But Rabbi Shapira is interested not in Jewish dying. He's interested in the ancient biblical dictum, v'chai bahem. That is Jewish living. When we educate our children in Torah, he says, we do so because of mesirat nefesh. When we observe Shabbat, we do so because of mesirat nefesh. Human suffering is real, teaches the Piazetzner. Jewish suffering is surely real, but we should not define ourselves by it. We must transcend it by living with it, by living even within it. I've shared with you before a famous midrash on our Parsha in which Abraham discovers a birat doleket, that is, a burning palace. Noticing the palace, Avraham questions whether anyone is actually in charge. And God peeks out from the window in that moment, admitting as much. Now, it's a layered and a rich text with much worth interrogating, but the Piazetzner's take is intriguing, I think. There are many instances, he writes, that the Kadosh Baruch Hu peeks into our Jewish heart and soul and says to us, I am the owner of this building. I am in charge of this world, and I am your God. It is just that we don't hear or feel it, because all day we are preoccupied in our issues and lost in that which upsets us, he says. When we settle our mind and distance ourselves from interacting, at least for short periods, from the tumult of the world and our thoughts and our desires, then we can set aside periods for Torah. Paradoxically, Rabbi Shapira suggests we not run away from the palace, but accept that we are within it. A person who is spiritually ill does not feel that she is enclosed in a burning building. Therefore, he says, the Midrash teaches us this: the Holy One of Blessing is not revealed to us except when we're able to feel that we are in a burning building right now. This kind of connection to God, born out of the urgency of seeing a raging fire, whether the burning palace or the fiery furnace, began with Avraham Avinu, our forefather. Misirat Nefesh, total, immersive, joyful engagement in Torah learning and doing and being, as Miriam taught so beautifully last week, is a bulwark against despair. But solo Misirat Nefesh is not what Jewish tradition demands of us. In order to truly access our joy, in order to stand within the burning palace and feel as if there's a world worth fighting for, a life worth living, we need not solitude but solidarity. We must share our grief just as we must share our joy. To suffer alone is to run the risk of being consumed by our suffering. To allow others to suffer alone is to give up on their humanity and potential for thriving. To pray and learn and live with others is to feel God's image, God's presence radiating out into the world. That's what makes this pandemic moment so hard, and that's what makes learning into the community so essential. The Piazetzner was born into a world of fire. During the Holocaust, he would go on to write another text, Eish Kodesh, holy fire. Ultimately, he would perish in the fires of the Shoah. This Tuesday, November 3rd, as Americans go to the polls, marks 77 years to the day since Operation Harvest Festival, when approximately 43,000 Jews, including Rabbi Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, were gunned down by SS troops and Nazi collaborators. The Piazetzner's legacy of teaching and learning and questioning and struggling and joyous Misirat Nefesh continues to inspire and motivate those who share his powerful Torah. So today, I don't want to talk to you about voting or election anxiety or election integrity or Jewish grief after Pittsburgh or black grief after Walter Wallace Jr. was gunned down this week in Philadelphia. Well, I guess despite myself, I've talked about all those things. But what I want us to remember on this Shabbat, when our Torah introduces us to the first Jewish story, is that solidarity with our people and others who experience oppression, connectivity with our traditions and our God. These are technologies of human thriving. To grow ourselves, we must live beyond ourselves. To save ourselves, we must share ourselves. And holy sharing, as it were, is what animates those first two Jews. Ben Sachs, a Beth Am member and the Jewish scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, referenced a midrashic tradition this week about Abraham and Sarah's name changes, which occur in our Parsha. Both Avram and Sarai receive a hey in their names. Avram becomes Avraham and Sarai becomes Sarah. Hey is a divine letter, since it's included in Yud Hey Vav Hey, the Tetragrammaton, Shem HaMifarash, the proper and unpronounceable name of God. But Sarai also loses a divine letter. The Yud is removed from her name in order to make the change. And the Yerushalmi, the so-called Jerusalem Talmud, explains Rav Huna said in the name of Rav Acha, the letter Yud was removed from Sarai's name and was divided into two letters. One Hey was added to Avraham and the other to Sarah. You may know that by tradition, Hebrew letters and numbers are the same. So Yud equals 10, Hey equals 5. So the godliness of 10 is distributed equally to Sarah and Abraham. It's shared. Eric Lidgy, the director of the Jewish Archives at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, concludes his haunting essay this way. I'll give him the last word. Since my epiphany in the car that gray October morning, I've spent some part of every day trying to reckon with the murkiness of my grief by describing the grief of other people as it exists in the thousands of things they created. Anytime I look outside myself and I marvel at what I see, I always feel a little better. When I return to myself and to my tired thoughts, I am changed. And until that feeling wears off, I can breathe again. Shabbat Shalom.